Hello everyone, Chris Whitten here. Glad to be back with you today. So I decided to take a little bit of a break from doing the Texas Red Dirt Revolution history stuff. Yesterday was actually St. Patrick's Day, so it got me thinking about my most memorable St. Patrick's Day. It's a little story that tells a little bit about both my fiddle and one of the really cool adventures that I got to go on overseas. So let's dive right on in. So the first conversations I heard about us possibly going to Iraq to do any kind of shows or anything like that had to have been about 2 or 3 years before we actually went. At the time, it was real popular. A lot of guys were doing DVDs, live DVDs to go along with the live album release. We talked about doing that, and in the process, we're bandying about ideas, as far as where would we do a DVD like that? And one of the thoughts or options was at the Alamo, there in front of it on the steps. There was some difficulties with that as far as being able to serve alcohol. The Alamo is run by the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. They do not allow alcohol on the grounds of the Alamo. Of course, we were sponsored by Budweiser. They would have helped fund some of that. So that would have kind of a conflict of interest there and a little bit of an issue. So instead of that, we started toying with the idea of actually trying to do a DVD for film it in front of the troops there at Saddam's palace, Al-Fal Palace, there in Baghdad. As I recall, I know that someone actually contacted the military about it. I believe that they said we could do it as far as permission-wise and everything like that. But I don't remember now. There was some kind of hitch with it. I don't remember what the ultimate deciding factor was in it. Long story short, the DVD project never did happen. But for several years after that, it came up quite regularly. We all wanted to the opportunity to go over there and entertain the troops. So finally one day we had a meeting with our management, a guy by the name of Jimmy Perkins, who was based out of Kerrville. He had also managed Pat Green as well as Charlie Robinson. And at that point, that's when they announced to us that we did have the opportunity to go overseas. It was up to us each individually. And the plan was to be both Kevin Fowler and our buddy Charlie Robinson would go on this trip overseas. We wanted to put together a band, kind of a throw-together band between his guys and our guys, so that one band could go and back both artists, and we just do it like that. The logistics of all that was sorted out. We figured out what personnel was going to go with us on that trip, and then they contacted Stuart Ramser from Texas Monthly Magazine, and Stuart wanted to go with us to do a feature article on it. So everything seemed to be falling in place. We started getting everything together for it as far as logistics-wise. An announcement was made, which it was kind of interesting. For those of y'all who are not real familiar with Charlie Robinson, he was actually married to the banjo player, Emily, from the Dixie Chicks. Of course, right around this time, there was some goings-on as far as with the Dixie Chicks, something that Natalie Maines had said. It caused quite an uproar, politically speaking, as a comment that she made when they were performing over in France. So as soon as the announcement was made, it came to our attention that there was actually some people kind of putting us down on some of the forums. This was before social media really became a big thing. And there were a lot of forums like on MTV, VH1, CMT, on their online content where the fans could get on and discuss things. And there was a thread started that essentially accused us of doing this just to try to make the Dixie Chicks look good vicariously, since Charlie was married to one of them. Of course, that really had nothing to do with it. It was really, honestly, kind of offensive. We were all really gung-ho and really excited to go. I remember for me, the moment that it really became real to me is I had to fill out some paperwork for the government at that point. Of course, they did background checks on all of us and a number of different things. But one of the things, they had a questionnaire we had to fill out. We had to tell them like our clothing sizes so they could fit us with bulletproof vests. We had to give them just several different bits of information. But one of the things that really stood out to me is they asked what, if any, religious affiliation you had, in the event that something happened to you, if you would need or want last rites, sort of stuff like that. It was very sobering, and it was a moment in which I think we all really realized what we were getting ourselves into. This wasn't a game. This was for real. So come time to leave, we actually flew out, I think it was on a Sunday, and we had been on the road for 4 days. I personally wasn't feeling real great. I have lupus for one, but we had to get all of these immunizations before we could go. And so we had gone on the road, I believe, Wednesday. The day before we left, I actually went in and got something like 6 or 7 immunizations. They immunized us for all sorts of things, stuff that I didn't even know still existed. I'm talking like Oregon Trail diseases, and I even had a rabies shot in the course of all that. So I wasn't feeling real great, and of course we were on the road all weekend. We were out for like 4 or 5 days. And we ended up in Corpus Christi. We played the big Concrete Street Amphitheater down there, and I think that was a package show, maybe with Pat Green and a number of other guys, Reckless Kelly and some Ragweed and some of them. I don't remember for sure now, but anyway, of course we were up pretty late with that, and it was kind of a farewell party for us, getting ready to leave. So I think we left Corpus around 2 o'clock in the morning and headed to San Antonio for our 8 a.m. flight. So I'll never forget, we got there, we got checked into the airport, everything was good. All I wanted to do is get on the plane and go to sleep at that point. I was exhausted, and it came a terrible downpour right about the time we were supposed to board our plane, so our flight was delayed. I actually fell asleep there at the gate for a little bit. Then they went ahead and boarded the plane. We get on. I fell asleep again, and then I woke up to an empty plane. The only people left in there were Kevin and the flight attendants, and he looked at me and goes, "Hey man, we're in Newark, New Jersey. We got to change planes." And I said, "Really? Wow, I didn't even realize we left the ground." He goes, "We didn't. We've been delayed again. We got to get off the plane." So he laughed, I laughed. So we got off the plane, and I don't remember, we had to sit around for another probably 45 minutes before we reboarded the plane. Headed to Newark, New Jersey. By the time we got to Newark, they were holding our next flight going from Newark to Frankfurt, Germany. We left out of one gate and ran as hard as we could with an escort to the next gate, got on our international flight, and within probably 15 minutes we were wheels up again, headed on to Frankfurt. Unfortunately, though, that delay did catch up with us once we got to Germany, because our plane from Frankfurt on to Kuwait City was actually taken off as we were landing, so we missed that. They only had one flight out a day. They told us we could either go get a hotel room, spend the night there in Frankfurt, and try again the next day, or we could backtrack to London, that they had a flight going out. We'd have like a 9-hour layover there at Heathrow Airport in London. So that's what we did. We waited like an hour and a half, boarded a plane, flew from Frankfurt back over to London. We just sat there and cooled our heels for about 9 hours waiting for our flight out to head on to Kuwait from that point. So we got into Kuwait City on the day that we actually were supposed to play our first show. We were supposed to do 2 bases there in Kuwait before we transitioned on into Iraq at that point. So we missed that show. Our liaisons and security detail and everything in Kuwait, they knew that our flight had been delayed, obviously. They didn't have any clue what plane we would actually be coming in on. They didn't know when we were going to get there. We got there, we got our luggage, and we walked out of the airport in Kuwait City, and we were like, now what? Our manager, Jimmy Perkins, that I mentioned earlier, he went on the trip with us, so he was handling all that logistical stuff. I believe he did get a hold of somebody by phone. I don't remember us standing around there very long, maybe 45 minutes or so before several vans, and it reminded me of something from a movie, because they had these little funny-looking white vans pull up with the little curtains in them. They had red and blue flashers on them, like police lights, with a Suburban full of guys who kind of led our little motorcade. We tore out from the airport, and they were driving like crazy too. And we took off and headed across Kuwait City. It was real beautiful. I believe we got into town. It was a little right before lunchtime, I believe, maybe 10, 11 o'clock in the morning local time. Of course, it had been 48 hours in transit total to get from San Antonio to Kuwait City. We were all really exhausted, but they put us up in a very nice place at the Radisson there. And for anybody who's not familiar with Kuwait City, it's a beautiful place. It reminded me very much of being somewhere like Miami Beach. It was just gorgeous. All the signage was in Arabic and English. So and most everybody spoke at least a little bit of English. Everybody was very friendly to us. I was thrilled that I got to go out and swim in the Persian Gulf and just have that experience. And as I told in a video before, I noticed some U.S. warships headed through the Gulf, headed north towards Iran. And later that evening found out that Iran had seized a British vessel of some type, and they were detaining some British troops, I believe, or citizens. I don't remember exactly the details on it, but there was some concern there that if there was some kind of issues or some kind of fight broke out with Iran, that we would most likely be stuck there for an indeterminate period of time. So we were a little nervous about all that. But we were able to get a good night's sleep that night, and the next day we got up and they took us out to Camp Buehring, which was about a 2-hour drive just straight out in the middle of the desert outside of Kuwait City. That was the main hub or base there in Kuwait where all the troops passed through that were headed into and out of Iraq at that point. They'd given us these little buttons that said, I survived St. Patrick's Day at Camp Buehring in Kuwait. So I thought that was kind of cool, and it always stuck in my mind. It was probably, like I said, the most memorable St. Patrick's Day that I ever had. We had a great meal there at the base. It was, I'll never forget, it was Surf and Turf Day, so we got to have some steak and lobster, and I was really surprised by that. I said something to one of our handlers about it, and they said, yeah, don't tell anybody. It's the best kept secret in the military. So we played the show there at Camp Buehring. The next day we got up, we headed on out to Al Saleen Air Base there in Kuwait City to prepare to board the plane and fly on into an active war zone. It was really crazy. That was the point at which they went ahead and fitted us with our flak jackets. So those were Kevlar vests. They had 1-inch ceramic plates in them. They weighed a ton, and it took several days of wearing that thing for my shoulders and neck and everything to get used to it. I was so sore between wearing that and carrying a backpack and all my gear and everything. It was a lot to carry around on your back. But when they outfitted us and got us all suited up and made sure we knew the proper way to wear the vests and helmets and everything, they gave us some pointers. They said, for instance, that we were most vulnerable while we were boarding and deboarding the airplanes on the flight line. They told us to never put our arms up over our heads because if there was a sniper in the area, they knew that the best chance they had of shooting somebody that had a vest on was to shoot them in the armpit, and then the bullet, of course, would bounce around inside of the vest. So they gave us all these little warnings and tips and stuff like that, which yet again was another level of sobering when they were kind of giving us the whole rundown of all this stuff. From there, we went ahead and boarded a C-130, and it was really great. When we walked into the C-130, up in the front of it, they had a big Texas flag hanging there, and the pilot and flight crew came back talking to us, and come to find out these guys were fans. They were, these guys and gals, they were from San Antonio and had seen us at several venues there around San Antonio, like Cowboys Dance Hall and John T. Forrest Country Store out in Helotes and at the rodeo and such. So that was really, really cool, and they were real nice to us and let us take turns so we could come up on the flight deck and look around, and they were pointing stuff out to us, and I was able to take some pictures from the flight deck looking out the window. Those guys, they did an excellent job. I can't speak highly enough of the Air Force the entire time we were there. They took really great care of us. But we landed there at Baghdad at the international airport, got on the ground. We got in another one of those funny little buses with the little curtains and the flashing lights and all that stuff. But they took us to the dining facility. We had lunch, and as I said, this was in March of 2007, so they had what was known at the time as the surge. They were sending a whole lot of troops in, and we were seeing the effects of that on the ground. For instance, that day at lunchtime, we go into the dining facility, and there were so many troops there that they couldn't really handle everybody. There wasn't enough room for everybody to sit who were in the dining facility at the time, so we kind of had to wait for a spot to open up. And they had told us too, they didn't really want us to stay in a tight little group. They wanted us to spread out and just said, just find an empty seat, sit down and start talking to people. That's what you're here for. And that was really good. So I ended up doing that and talked to and met quite a few of our troops and had some really interesting conversations and got some details about just how things were actually going on the ground over there and what everybody was witnessing and all that sort of stuff. It was really fascinating. So from there, they went ahead and took us over to Saddam's Al-Fa Palace, which had been turned into kind of the main headquarters and the main hub for all of operations there in Iraq at the time. It was very, very large, and the construction of it was really interesting. There were a number of guest houses on the periphery of it, and it was built in an island in the middle of a lake. Of course, it's in a desert, so water is a sign of wealth. Saddam had built his palace with essentially, it was like having a moat around it, and had a couple of bridges that went into it. One of the bridges had been bombed during the initial invasion, and you could see the remnants of it where it had caved into the lake. They also showed us there in the water, Saddam had some special genetically modified fish that had, they were a type of bass that had diamond-shaped scales on them. The rumor was that these fish were man-eaters and that he would actually feed people that he assassinated to them. At least that was the story that we were told over there. But it was interesting that they had some like fish food there, and you could go up and feed the fish, and they would come up there and just swarm up around you while you were there. But going in, this thing was huge. This palace, it looked like a capitol building, like a state capitol or something like that. They told us that it actually wasn't as expensive as one might think, just looking around at it. They said that Saddam ordered it to be built so quickly, I think in something like less than a year, I believe, and they didn't even have time to source all the materials. So instead of being made out of marble, everything that looked like marble was actually polished gypsum. All these crystal chandeliers everywhere were plastic, so they cut corners all over the place. So that was really interesting. We got to sit in a throne that was given to Saddam by Yasser Arafat. And while we were there, they took us upstairs to the main offices of the general who was the main commander there on the ground. We got to meet with those guys and ask them some questions and take some pictures. And they presented us with some special awards and challenge medallions and so forth. It was really, really interesting to be there. To realize that you're in the command center of an actual military operation like that with the 5-star general having just a chat. Fascinating, really and honestly. So after that, we went on to our B huts, as they're called, which are kind of little plywood boxes. Got settled into our quarters, which we quartered on one camp. There are like 5 camps, like Camp Victory and all these different camps there in Baghdad. So we were staying at one camp, but we played in a different camp. And they got us all set up. And unfortunately, I was suffering. I ended up with an abscessed tooth from, I'd had an issue from a root canal. And my face was horribly swollen, so by this point I was starting to really have trouble with it that day. It bedeviled me the entire trip. The whole time we were there, I finally got to see a dentist the last day we were in country before we flew home. For much of the time I was pretty miserable, and I'll put some of the pictures in so you can see. And if you notice in the pictures, my face does look a little puffy and funny on one side, but that's why. We did our show that night there in Baghdad, and it was really crazy because, the military, the U.S. military, the coalition forces just owned the night over there. It was pretty quiet during the day, but these guys would go out on these massive patrols at night. We started playing right around sundown there, and all the troops come in, and they're all outfitted, ready to leave as soon as we get done playing to head out on maneuvers and on patrols. It did bother me looking around because so many of them looked so young. I mean, I was only 26 at the time, but some of these guys and gals who are 18, 19, 20 years old, and they just look like kids. It was very sobering while we were playing, looking out across that crowd and realizing that any one of them may not come home from that trip that night. They might have just seen their last sunset. So you always kind of had that in the back of your mind the entire time you were there. That being said, they kept us so busy that you really didn't have time to process anything. For me, it wasn't until I got home and had a chance to just kind of sit and think about it in some peace and quiet that I was able to process the whole trip. So each morning from there, we did the show. And at night, I had just gotten this fiddle where I was playing it. I had kind of stripped some of the finish down on it and distressed it a little bit, and it actually sounded better. I've got some tape residue here on the back. I need to clean that off, but I don't know how well you can see. I can put some better pictures in. So I went ahead, and this fiddle was actually unsealed at the time. So each evening after we finished our show, we did a meet and greet. I kept my fiddle out because the Air Force guys would come in and load over gear and put it on pallets so it could be loaded onto the airplane for the next morning's trip. Anyway, I went ahead and got all the troops to sign my fiddle on the back, some of them on the sides. I had a few that insisted that they wanted to sign up here, even though I told them it was going to wear off pretty quickly, but they just wanted to sign it there. And there have been a few signatures that wore off. Of course, I sealed it up once I got home to protect all those signatures. Anyhow, at this point, that's why I always call this my war fiddle. I felt like it's appropriate because it looks like it's been through war, and it's green, so it all kind of fit together for me, and having all the signatures. So it does really mean a whole lot to me. We would do those meet and greets after the show each night, and after we got done with that, we would try to get a little bit of rest. But that being said, there were a lot of offers to take us out to do things. Not necessarily things that they were supposed to take us out to do, but, and it turned into a one-up fest. Every time we'd get to a base, we'd tell them, last night they let us shoot a machine gun. They're like, just wait till tonight. Have you ever driven a tank? So anyway, we did some stuff that probably would have gotten some folks in trouble if the powers that be knew anything about it. But it was a crazy amount of fun. So, by the time we got done with our show and got everything loaded and finished with the meet and greet, it was, close to midnight. We would go ahead and, like I said, go out and drive tanks and shoot stuff and things like that each night. Just, whatever these guys offered to take us to do for fun. It was pretty incredible, actually. I got a few pictures here and there. I'll put some pictures up of us shooting flares off one night. I believe that was in Kirkuk. We actually did sneak off the base that night. They radioed in to the flight line to make sure there wasn't any aircraft inbound or outbound, and to let them know that they were checking the back fence is what they said. So we got out there and got to fire off some flares and shoot an AK-47 that had been taken, and just some crazy stuff like that. So we were out until about probably 2 in the morning, and bear in mind we had to get up at 5 a.m. They would go ahead and take us over the flight line to get checked in. At that point, they'd have all of our gear and everything already on the pallets, be loading that onto the C-130 or C-17, depending on whichever one we were flying on that day. Then they would take us over to the dining facility. We'd get some breakfast and stop by the Green Bean Coffee Shop and pick up everybody that drank coffee. We'd get some coffee. We'd head back to the flight line, get on the plane, and generally we'd have in the neighborhood of an hour flight each morning to head on to the next base. It was very interesting on those flights, too. That's when we, probably took most of the fire and were in the most danger. And, of course, you were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing. So we would only be flying at about 5,000 feet, typically, just cruising. But once we come into land, they would come in directly over the flight line and do a combat landing where they would pitch up and corkscrew in like this and come right in at the end of the runway and just set right down on the runway like that. There were a couple of times that it was pretty hairy. We knew that we were taking fire. Of course, they had 20-millimeter cannons, rear part of the plane there on each side with gun crews on those. A few times that we got into that spiral turn, and they broke out of the turn back to the other and back and forth, and we were pulling some pretty good G's. You couldn't really see outside either. It had these little porthole-looking windows behind us that, I could just, basically 1 second you would see sky, and the next second you'd see the ground, and 1 second your arms would float up in the air, and the next second you couldn't pick them up out of your lap, and the whole time you could hear the 20 millimeters going off in the back of the plane, just vroom, 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 vroom. Got to see quite a few things of historical significance while we were there. I remember in Al-Assad, they showed us Abraham's oasis that they were talking about from the Bible when Abraham was lost in the wilderness. Some things like that were just absolutely fascinating while we were there. We were shown some different things relating to Saddam and his regime and his sons. They showed us the Olympic swimming pool where they had drained it, and after the Iraqi Olympic swim team had not won a gold medal at the Olympics, they actually took them and lined them up in the bottom of that pool and machine gunned all of them to death. It's out in the desert, so there's still, blood stains on the side of this pool, and you can see all the bullet holes and the cracked tile and all that sort of stuff. It was pretty intense, to say the least. As far as taking fire on the ground, the worst we saw, I believe, was there in Balad, which at the time we got there, they told us that the nickname of Balad was Margaritaville. And there were a couple of young GIs who had actually written a song, a spoof of Margaritaville, just talking about all the mortars that they were taking there. Laughingly, they told us that they had a mortar actually come through the roof of the dining facility and land in the middle of a bowl of iceberg lettuce on the salad bar. But fortunately, it was a dud. I remember the first time we got a warning that we had incoming ordnance, as they call it. These sirens went off that were stationed around the base, and a voice came over this loudspeaker. It said, incoming ordnance, please take cover. That actually even happened about 5 minutes before we were supposed to walk on stage. And that was really kind of a pucker up moment because, at that point you realize, man, where do I go? I don't know where this thing is coming from. I don't know where it's going to land. That was a little crazy to realize some stuff's being lobbed at you like that, and you don't really know what it is, where it's coming from, or anything like that. But they had they call them burp guns, where they fire like 20,000 rounds a minute, and they just put up a curtain of lead, and you could hear those go off. And essentially, they just shot the stuff out of the sky, and then they would call the all clear over the PA system and just warn everybody to be on the lookout for UXOs, which means unexploded ordnance. But that was pretty intense to be experiencing that. And of course, there were several attacks while we were actually on stage playing. Of course, like I said, I think the majority of this stuff and what they told us was very old Soviet stuff. A lot of it was duds, didn't go off, and at least we had that going for us. I did see one mortar explode when we were in Baghdad. I got up to use the restroom just as the sun was coming up, probably about 5 o'clock in the morning. And as I was standing right outside of our hut, I heard a noise and looked up, and probably about 110 yards away from me, a mortar hit the ground, but it was out in the wide open, and it just, blew up a bunch of dust, and that was it. And of course, I was half asleep. I thought to myself, I wonder if I should tell somebody about that. And then I thought, well, you idiot. Who would you tell? You have no way of contacting anybody. You would just have to wander around until you found somebody. And I'm sure that they're well aware that somebody done lobbed a mortar at us, So from there, we finished up there in Balad. The next morning, we flew out. We headed back to Kuwait City, stayed at the same hotel and everything. And as I told in an earlier video talking about traveling abroad, we had the opportunity to go out on the town that evening and go have a nice dinner. The place was recommended to us by our sound crew. They were actually from Kuwait. That was really great, a great experience. A little scary riding in a cab across Kuwait City, but it was well worth it. The food was awesome, and it was a lot of fun. So we got up the next morning, boarded the plane. We left out at 8 a.m. local time, where we landed at 11:30 p.m. of the same calendar day in Austin, but it had taken us 52 hours to get home. Fortunately, when we got home that night, we found out that half of our instruments had not made it on our plane leaving Heathrow Airport there in London, so they didn't actually arrive in Austin until about 10:30 the next morning. We'd already left town, but thankfully the guys who were opening for us for our show that night, they were leaving town a little bit later, and we were able to get a hold of them. So they stopped and picked all of our instruments and everything up and brought them with them to sound check. One other thing, too, after we got home and went back out on the road that next day, we stopped for lunch. And unfortunately, we found out both our steel guitar player and Artie and myself had our credit cards stolen while we were there, our credit card numbers, and they cleaned out our bank accounts. So that took a little bit of time to get that all sorted out and get my money reimbursed from that. But it's kind of stuff you have to deal with when you're traveling abroad like that. I thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully I didn't ramble on too much, and hopefully you enjoyed this little story about traveling and entertaining our troops. I appreciate all the feedback. Please like, subscribe, and share. I'm much grateful for all of that. And also, of course, if you need some violin or fiddle tracks, or you would like to do some lessons, please contact me. I'd be more than happy to work with you on that as well. So I hope each and every one of you have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and keep on picking.